The old yellow school bus wheezed to a stop in front of the massive iron gates. Tommy pressed his face against the foggy window and stared at the most beautiful school he had ever seen. Stone towers reached up toward the cloudy sky like something from a fairy tale. Students in crisp uniforms walked across perfectly manicured lawns, their expensive bags slung over their shoulders. "This is it, kid," said the bus driver, giving Tommy a sympathetic look. "You sure you got the right place?" Tommy nodded and clutched his acceptance letter tighter. The paper was already wrinkled from being folded and unfolded so many times. He had read it at least 100 times, still not quite believing it was real. Westfield Academy was accepting him on a full scholarship. Him, a foster kid who had moved from home to home more times than he could count. The bus pulled away, leaving Tommy standing alone at the entrance. He picked up his beat-up duffel bag and walked through the gates. Everything around him screamed money. The buildings were made of beautiful gray stone. The gardens looked like they belonged in a magazine. Even the pathways were made of fancy brick instead of regular concrete. Other students were arriving too, but they came in shiny black cars and SUVs that cost more than most people made in a year. Parents in expensive suits and designer dresses helped their children carry leather suitcases and instrument cases that probably cost more than Tommy's entire wardrobe. "Excuse me," Tommy said to a woman in a fur coat. "Can you tell me where the main office is?" She looked him up and down with barely hidden disgust. Her eyes took in his thrift store clothes, his worn sneakers, and his cheap duffel bag. "I wouldn't know," she said coldly, then walked away without another word. Tommy felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment, but he kept walking. He had dealt with people like this before. In his 16 years, he had learned that some people judge you before they even know your name, but he also knew that their opinions didn't define who he was or what he could become. Inside the main building, his footsteps echoed on marble floors that were so shiny he could see his reflection. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Oil paintings of important-looking people in fancy clothes lined the walls. Everything was polished and perfect, like a museum where real people weren't supposed to touch anything. "You must be Tommy," said a voice behind him. He turned to see a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. She wore a simple blue dress and comfortable shoes, and something about her made Tommy feel a little less out of place. "I'm Mrs. Patterson, the Student Services Coordinator," she said, extending her hand. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. Your caseworker told me quite a bit about your musical abilities." Tommy shook her hand, grateful to finally meet someone who didn't look at him like he was carrying a disease. "Let me show you to your room," Mrs. Patterson said, leading him down a long hallway. "You're in Harmony Hall, which is where most of our music scholarship students live." As they walked, she explained the daily routine. Breakfast was at 7, classes started at 8, and dinner was served at 6. Students were expected to be in their rooms by 10 on weeknights and 11 on weekends. There were study halls, mandatory chapel services, and endless rules about uniforms and behavior. "It might seem overwhelming at first," Mrs. Patterson said, stopping in front of a wooden door with the number 247 carved into it. "But you'll adjust. The other boys on this floor are good kids. They'll help you find your way around." She handed him a key and a thick packet of papers. "Your class schedule is in there, along with your uniform fittings appointment and your meeting with the music department head. That's tomorrow at 2 o'clock right after lunch." Tommy's room was small but clean. It had a single bed, a desk, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the school's gardens. After living in cramped apartments and sleeping on couches for most of his life, having his own space felt like luxury. He unpacked his few belongings and hung his clothes in the closet. Everything he owned fit easily in half the space. The other half remained empty, a reminder of how little he had compared to his new classmates. That evening at dinner, Tommy sat alone at a table in the corner of the massive dining hall. The food was better than anything he had eaten in years, but he barely tasted it. He was too busy watching the other students laugh and talk with their friends. They all seemed to know each other already, like they had been attending fancy schools their whole lives. "You're the new scholarship kid, right?" said a voice above him. Tommy looked up to see 3 boys standing by his table. The one in the middle was tall and blonde with the kind of confident smile that came from never having to worry about anything. His uniform was perfectly pressed, and his shoes looked like they had been polished that morning. "I'm Bradley," the boy said, not bothering to sit down. "My father sits on the board of directors here. He told me they were bringing in some charity cases this year." The other two boys laughed like Bradley had said something hilarious. Tommy felt his face getting hot, but he kept his voice steady. "My name is Tommy," he said quietly. "Right, Tommy," Bradley said, drawing out the name like it was funny. "So, what's your story? Foster homes? Juvenile detention? Or are you just regular poor?" Tommy stood up slowly, his fists clenched at his sides. He had learned long ago that bullies like Bradley only understood one language. But before he could say anything, Mrs. Patterson appeared beside their table. "Boys," she said firmly, "I believe you have somewhere else to be." Bradley's smile faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Of course, Mrs. Patterson, we were just welcoming Tommy to Westfield, making sure he feels at home." "How thoughtful," she said, her tone making it clear she didn't believe a word of it. "I'm sure Tommy appreciates your kindness." After the boys left, Mrs. Patterson sat down across from Tommy. "Don't let them get to you," she said softly. "Some of these kids have had everything handed to them their whole lives. They don't understand what it means to work for something." "Why did you help me?" Tommy asked. She smiled. "Because I was a scholarship kid once too, a long time ago. I know what it's like to feel like you don't belong. But let me tell you something, Tommy. You're here because you earned it. Your talent got you through those doors, not your parents' money or connections. Don't ever forget that." That night, Tommy lay in his narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. Through the thin walls, he could hear other students talking and laughing in their rooms. Some were on the phone with their parents, complaining about homework or asking for money. Others were planning weekend trips home or talking about summer vacations in Europe. Tommy had never had a real home to go to for the weekend. He had never been on a vacation anywhere, let alone another country. But he had something that many of these privileged kids would never have. He had learned to survive. He had learned to work hard for everything he wanted. And most importantly, he had learned that music could take him places that money never could. Tomorrow he would meet with the music department head. Tomorrow he would start classes with students who had been playing instruments since they were toddlers, taught by private teachers who charged more per lesson than Tommy's foster family spent on groceries in a month. But tonight, as he drifted off to sleep, Tommy allowed himself to dream about the possibilities that lay ahead. For the first time in his life, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. 3 weeks had passed since Tommy arrived at Westfield Academy, and he was finally starting to find his rhythm. His classes were challenging, but he worked twice as hard as everyone else to keep up. The other scholarship students had become his friends, and even some of the regular students had warmed up to him. But the thing that excited him most was the upcoming annual piano competition. The announcement had been posted on the music department bulletin board for 2 weeks now. The Westfield piano competition was the biggest event of the school year. The winner would receive a cash prize, a professional recording session, and most importantly, a recommendation letter to any music school in the country. For Tommy, this competition could change everything. "You're really going to enter?" asked his roommate Danny as they walked to breakfast one morning. Danny was also on scholarship, but for academics instead of music. He was a math genius who could solve equations that made Tommy's head spin. "I have to try," Tommy said, clutching his worn sheet music folder. "This could be my chance to prove I belong here." Danny looked worried. "Just be careful, man. I've heard some of these rich kids talking. They don't like the idea of a scholarship student winning their precious competition." Tommy had heard the whispers too, in the hallways, during lunch, even in the library. Some students made no effort to hide their resentment. They thought scholarships should go to kids who were already good at everything, not kids who actually needed the help. The music department at Westfield was housed in a separate building that looked like a small castle. Inside, practice rooms lined the hallways like tiny prison cells, each one containing a different instrument. Tommy had been assigned practice time in room 12B, and he spent every free moment there working on his pieces. The room contained the most beautiful piano he had ever seen. It was a shiny black grand piano that took up most of the space. The bench was made of rich mahogany, and the music stand was polished to perfection. When Tommy first saw it, he could hardly believe he was allowed to touch it, let alone play it every day. But something felt strange about the instrument from the very beginning. The keys seemed too light under his fingers, almost like they weren't connected to real hammers and strings. The sound was clear enough, but it lacked the deep, rich resonance he expected from such an expensive-looking piano. He figured it was just because he wasn't used to playing on such a fancy instrument. Maybe grand pianos are different, he told himself, sitting down to practice his competition pieces. He had chosen 2 difficult pieces that would showcase his technical skills and emotional range. The first was a Chopin piece that started soft and gentle but built to a powerful climax. The second was a thunderous Rachmaninoff composition that demanded both speed and precision. Both pieces were challenging for even advanced players, but Tommy had been working on them for months. Every day after classes, he would hurry to room 12B and practice for 2 hours straight. His fingers flew across the keys as he worked through difficult passages over and over again. Sometimes other students would walk by the door and peek in, but nobody ever stopped to listen or offer encouragement. Meanwhile, in the main practice rooms, the wealthy students worked with their private tutors and played on instruments that cost more than most people's cars. Victoria Blackwood, whose father owned a chain of music stores, had been taking piano lessons since she was 4 years old. She practiced on a concert-grade Steinway that the school had purchased specifically for competition students. "Did you see the foster boy signed up for the competition?" Victoria said to her friends during lunch one day. Tommy was sitting just 2 tables away, but she made no effort to lower her voice. "Seriously?" laughed her friend Catherine. "What's he going to play, chopsticks?" "I heard he practices on that old piano in 12B, Victoria continued. "Poor thing, probably thinks it's actually worth something." The girls erupted in giggles and Tommy felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. He kept eating his sandwich and pretended not to hear, but every word cut deep. He had grown up being looked down on, but it never got easier. After lunch, Tommy went to the music office to confirm his competition entry. Mrs. Henderson, the department secretary, was a stern woman who rarely smiled. She looked at his entry, form like it was covered in germs. "You understand this is a very serious competition," she said, adjusting her glasses. "Students spend years preparing for this event. Are you certain you're ready?" "Yes, ma'am," Tommy replied. Though his voice came out smaller than he intended, she stamped his form with unnecessary force and handed him a practice schedule. "Room 12B is available to you for 2 hours each weekday and 4 hours on weekends. The competition is in 6 weeks. I suggest you use your time wisely." Tommy nodded and left the office, clutching his schedule. 6 weeks to perfect 2 of the most difficult pieces in the piano repertoire. 6 weeks to prove he deserved to be at Westfield Academy. 6 weeks to show everyone that talent mattered more than money. But as the days passed, something continued to bother him about the piano in room 12B. During one particularly intense practice session, he noticed that when he pressed the keys very hard, they felt almost bouncy, like there was some kind of electronic mechanism underneath. Real piano keys had weight and resistance that came from actual hammers striking strings. One afternoon, while working on a particularly delicate passage that required perfect touch control, Tommy stopped playing and stared at the instrument. He had never played on a real grand piano before, but something deep in his gut told him this wasn't right. He looked under the piano and saw something that made his heart sink. There were electrical cords running from the base of the instrument to outlets in the wall. Real acoustic pianos didn't need to be plugged in. Tommy's hands began to shake as the horrible truth dawned on him. This wasn't a real piano at all. It was some kind of electronic keyboard disguised to look like a grand piano. While other students practiced on instruments worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, he had been fooled into practicing on what was essentially a toy. He sat on the bench for a long time, staring at the fake piano keys. All those hours of practice, all that preparation, all his dreams of winning the competition, it had all been based on a lie. The rich kids hadn't just excluded him from their social circles. They had actually sabotaged his chances of succeeding. The cruelest part was how obvious it should have been. The two light keys, the electronic sound, the way it never needed tuning, like the other pianos in the building. He felt stupid for not realizing it sooner. But why would anyone expect such elaborate cruelty from fellow students? Tommy wanted to storm out of the room and confront Victoria and her friends. He wanted to march into the music department office and demand answers. He wanted to call Mrs. Patterson and tell her what was happening, but instead he sat perfectly still and let the anger wash over him like a wave. After a few minutes, something else replaced the anger. It was a feeling he had experienced many times before in foster homes and schools where he didn't belong. It was the quiet determination that came from being underestimated. They expected him to give up, to withdraw from the competition in embarrassment. They expected him to prove their point that scholarship kids didn't belong at Westfield. Tommy placed his hands back on the fake piano keys and began to play. If they wanted to play games, he would play along. But he would also find a way to turn their cruel joke against them. He had 6 weeks to figure out how to win a piano competition while practicing on a fake instrument. The music filled the small room as Tommy played with more intensity than ever before. He didn't know how he would overcome this obstacle, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let them win. Tommy stared at the ceiling of his dorm room, unable to sleep. It had been 3 days since he discovered the fake piano, and he still hadn't figured out what to do about it. The competition was only 5 weeks away, and every day of practice on that electronic keyboard was making things worse, not better. He had tried confronting the music department, but Mrs. Henderson just shrugged and said all practice room assignments were final. When he asked about switching rooms, she told him there was a 6-month waiting list. Tommy knew she was lying, but he had no way to prove it. "You're up early again," said Danny, his roommate, as Tommy quietly got dressed in the dark. It was barely 5 in the morning, but Tommy couldn't stay in bed any longer. "Can't sleep," Tommy whispered back, trying not to wake the other boys on their floor. "This is about the piano thing, isn't it?" Danny asked, sitting up in his bed. "Why don't you just report them? What they're doing isn't right." Tommy had thought about it 100 times, but he knew how these things worked. Victoria's father was a major donor to the school. Her friends' families had buildings named after them. If Tommy made accusations without proof, it would be his word against theirs. And everyone knew whose word would count more at a place like Westfield. "I'll figure something out," Tommy said, grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. The campus was completely empty at this hour. Security guards patrolled the grounds, but they mostly stayed in their warm office drinking coffee and watching security monitors. Tommy had figured out their routine weeks ago. He knew exactly when and where he could move around without being seen. The music building was locked, but Tommy had noticed that one of the basement windows didn't close properly. It was a small window near the loading dock, probably broken for months without anyone bothering to fix it. Tommy was thin enough to squeeze through, and once inside, he could access the main building through the connecting hallway. His heart pounded as he crept through the dark corridors. Getting caught would mean immediate expulsion, and he couldn't afford to lose his scholarship. But he also couldn't win the competition without practicing on a real piano. The main concert hall was at the center of the music building, and Tommy had only seen it during orientation. It was a beautiful room, with red velvet seats and a stage that could hold a full orchestra. But the centerpiece was the piano that sat in the middle of the stage, illuminated by a single spotlight. It was a Steinway concert grand, the kind of instrument that professional pianists dreamed of playing. The black surface was so polished that Tommy could see his reflection in it. Just looking at it made his hands itch to touch the keys. He climbed onto the stage and approached the piano carefully, as if it might disappear if he moved too quickly. The bench was made of the same rich wood as the piano itself, and it was positioned at exactly the right height. Tommy sat down and gently lifted the lid that covered the keys. The keys were made of real ivory, yellowed slightly with age but perfectly smooth under his fingertips. When he pressed middle C, the sound that filled the concert hall was like nothing he had ever heard. It was warm and rich and full, with overtones that seemed to hang in the air forever. Tommy began to play scales, just to get used to the feel of the instrument. The keys had weight and resistance that made his fingers work harder, but the sound they produced was incredible. Every note was clear and distinct, but they also blended together in harmonies that made his chest vibrate. After warming up, he started working on his competition pieces. The Chopin sounded completely different on a real piano. Passages that had seemed impossible on the fake instrument suddenly made sense. The delicate sections sang with a sweetness that brought tears to his eyes, while the powerful climaxes thundered through the empty hall. "Beautiful playing," said a voice from the back of the hall. Tommy's hands froze on the keys and his heart nearly stopped. He turned around slowly, expecting to see a security guard with handcuffs ready. Instead, he saw an elderly man in a janitor's uniform walking down the aisle toward the stage. "Please don't call security," Tommy said, his voice shaking. "I know, I'm not supposed to be here, but I can explain." The man smiled and held up his hands. "Relax, son. I'm not going to get you in trouble. I'm just curious about what brings you here so early in the morning." "I'm Tommy," he said, still not sure if he should trust the stranger. "I'm a student here. I'm supposed to compete in the piano competition, but they gave me a fake piano to practice on." The janitor's smile disappeared. "A fake piano? What do you mean?" Tommy explained about room 12B and the electronic keyboard disguised as a grand piano. The janitor listened carefully, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "My name is Robert," the janitor said when Tommy finished. "I've been working at this school for 32 years, and I've seen plenty of cruel pranks. But this is something else entirely." Robert walked closer to the stage and looked up at Tommy. "You know, I come in here every morning at 5:30 to clean. The hall is always empty until classes start. If someone happened to be practicing during that time, I probably wouldn't notice." Tommy's eyes widened as he understood what Robert was suggesting. "You mean I could practice here? On this piano?" "I didn't say that," Robert said with a wink. "I just said I probably wouldn't notice. But if someone was going to practice here, they'd need to be very careful, and they'd need to be gone by 7 o'clock when the faculty starts arriving." From that morning on, Tommy's life changed completely. He would wake up at 4:30, sneak out of his dorm, and make his way to the concert hall. Robert would unlock the building early and leave it open for him. Tommy would practice for an hour and a half, then slip back to his room before anyone noticed he was gone. The difference was incredible. Every day his playing improved dramatically. The real piano responded to his touch in ways the fake one never could. He could play softly and the notes would shimmer like whispers. He could play forcefully and the sound would fill the entire hall with power. But the transition wasn't easy. His muscle memory was all wrong from weeks of practicing on the fake piano. The keys were heavier, the pedals worked differently, and the sound projection was completely different. Tommy had to relearn both of his competition pieces almost from scratch. Some mornings, he would get so frustrated that he wanted to give up. His fingers would cramp from the unfamiliar resistance of the keys. His back would ache from sitting at the proper height. But every time he thought about quitting, he remembered Victoria's laughter and Bradley's cruel words. Robert became his unofficial coach during those early morning sessions. The janitor had grown up playing piano himself, though he never had the chance to pursue it professionally. He would sit in the back of the hall and offer gentle suggestions about Tommy's technique and interpretation. "You're playing the notes correctly," Robert said one morning, "but you're not telling the story. Music isn't just about hitting the right keys at the right time. It's about making people feel something." Tommy didn't understand at first, but gradually he began to see what Robert meant. The Chopin piece wasn't just a series of difficult passages. It was about longing and loss and hope. The Rachmaninoff wasn't just about speed and power. It was about triumph over adversity. As Tommy learned to connect with the emotional content of the music, his playing transformed. He wasn't just playing notes anymore. He was sharing his experiences, the loneliness of foster care, the frustration of being looked down on, the determination to prove himself worthy. Meanwhile, during the day, he continued his charade in room 12B. He would practice on the fake piano for his assigned hours, making sure other students could see him through the window. Victoria and her friends would walk by and smirk, confident that their plan was working perfectly. But Tommy had a secret now. Every morning, in the empty concert hall, he was becoming the pianist he was meant to be. The competition was only 2 weeks away, and he was ready to show everyone what he could really do. The hardest part was keeping his excitement hidden. When classmates asked how his practice was going, he would shrug and say it was fine. When teachers asked if he was ready for the competition, he would nod nervously and say he hoped so. But inside, Tommy was burning with anticipation. He couldn't wait to sit down at that Steinway concert grand in front of the entire school and show them what real talent looked like. Victoria and her friends had given him a fake piano to humiliate him, but they had also given him something else, the motivation to become better than they ever imagined possible. The morning of the competition arrived with a thunderstorm that seemed to shake the entire campus. Tommy woke up to the sound of rain pounding against his window and lightning flashing across the dark sky. He had barely slept, his mind racing, with everything that could go wrong. "You look terrible," Danny said, rolling over in his bed. "Did you sleep at all?" "Maybe an hour," Tommy admitted, getting dressed in his best clothes. They weren't fancy, but Mrs. Patterson had helped him find a decent black suit at the thrift store in town. It was a little too big, but it would have to do. "You're going to be great," Danny said, sitting up. "I've heard you practicing in the shower. You sing those melodies like they're part of your soul." Tommy tried to smile, but his stomach was twisted in knots. Today wasn't just about winning a competition. It was about proving that he belonged at Westfield Academy. It was about showing everyone that talent mattered more than money or connections. The competition was scheduled to begin at 7 in the evening, giving students the entire day to prepare. Most of the wealthy kids would spend the day with their private coaches, working on last-minute details and mental preparation. Tommy didn't have a coach, but he had something else. He had Robert's encouragement and months of secret practice on the real piano. At breakfast, the dining hall buzzed with excitement. Parents had arrived from all over the country to watch their children perform. Tommy recognized some faces from magazines and newspapers, famous musicians, business leaders, and politicians who had flown in for the event. Victoria sat at her usual table, surrounded by her friends and family. Her mother was a former opera singer who still carried herself like royalty. Her father owned a chain of music stores and had personally donated the Steinway piano that would be used in the competition. They were discussing Victoria's chances of winning like it was already decided. The scholarship students shouldn't even be allowed to compete. Tommy heard Victoria's mother say in a voice loud enough for half the dining hall to hear, "This is supposed to be about excellence, not charity." Tommy felt his face burn with embarrassment, but he kept eating his breakfast. He had learned long ago that responding to comments like that only made things worse. Instead, he focused on his plan for the day. After breakfast, he went to room 12B one last time. He sat at the fake piano and ran through his pieces, but his heart wasn't in it. His fingers knew these melodies so well that he could play them in his sleep. What worried him was the transition from the electronic keyboard to the real Steinway on stage. Around noon, Tommy walked to the concert hall to check out the setup. The stage had been decorated with flowers, and rows of additional chairs had been brought in to accommodate the crowd. The Steinway sat in the center of the stage like a black jewel, polished until it gleamed under the stage lights. "Nervous?" asked a familiar voice behind him. Tommy turned to see Robert pushing a cart of cleaning supplies. The janitor had become like a grandfather to him over the past few weeks, offering advice and encouragement during those early morning practice sessions. "Terrified," Tommy admitted. "What if I mess up? What if my fingers freeze? What if I forget the music?" Robert smiled and put a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Son, I've been listening to you play every morning for weeks. You know those pieces better than you know your own name. But more importantly, you understand what they mean. When you sit down at that piano tonight, don't think about winning or losing. Just think about telling your story." "My story?" Every person who sits in that audience tonight has a story, Robert explained. Some of them have had everything handed to them. Others have had to fight for every opportunity. When you play, you're not just playing notes. You're sharing what it means to never give up, even when the whole world seems against you. Tommy spent the afternoon walking around campus trying to calm his nerves. He called his caseworker, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had driven 3 hours to be there for his performance. She was staying at a cheap motel in town, but she wouldn't miss this for anything. "I'm so proud of you," she said when they met for an early dinner. "Regardless of what happens tonight, you've already accomplished something amazing. You've proven that you can succeed anywhere." "But what if I don't win?" Tommy asked. "What if all this was for nothing?" Mrs. Rodriguez reached across the table and took his hand. "Tommy, I've placed dozens of kids in foster homes over the years. Most of them just try to survive until they age out of the system. But you're different. You don't just survive, you thrive. Win or lose, you're going to be successful in life because you never give up." As evening approached, Tommy returned to his dorm room to change into his performance clothes. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely button his shirt. Danny helped him with his tie and wished him luck. The concert hall was packed by the time Tommy arrived. Every seat was filled and people were standing along the walls. The stage lights were bright and hot, making the piano gleam like it was made of liquid metal. Tommy found a seat in the green room, where performers waited for their turn. 12 students had qualified for the final competition and they would perform in random order. Tommy's name had been drawn 7th, right in the middle. The first performer was a senior named Christopher, whose family owned a chain of hotels. He played a Mozart sonata with technical precision but little emotion. The audience applauded politely when he finished. The second performer was a junior who had been taking lessons since she was 3 years old. Her Chopin waltz was beautiful but predictable. Tommy could tell she had been coached to play it exactly the same way every time. As each student performed, Tommy felt his nervousness growing. These were all talented musicians who had been preparing for competitions their entire lives. They had expensive instruments at home, private teachers, and parents who understood classical music. Victoria performed 5th, playing a Liszt piece that showcased her technical abilities. She hit every note perfectly and her timing was flawless. The audience gave her enthusiastic applause and Tommy could see her parents beaming with pride. "She's going to be hard to beat," whispered the student sitting next to Tommy. Tommy nodded, but he wasn't really listening. He was thinking about Robert's words and Mrs. Rodriguez's encouragement. He was thinking about all the foster homes where he had felt unwanted, all the schools where he had been looked down on, all the times he had been told he wasn't good enough. When his name was called, Tommy stood up on shaky legs and walked toward the stage. The audience seemed to quiet down as he appeared. He could hear whispers about the scholarship kid and the foster boy. Some people seemed genuinely curious to see what he could do. Others looked like they were waiting for him to embarrass himself. Tommy climbed the steps to the stage and walked to the piano. The stage lights were blinding, making it impossible to see individual faces in the audience. For a moment, he just stood there, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment. Then he sat down at the bench and adjusted it to the right height. He placed his hands on the keys and felt their familiar weight and texture. This was the same piano he had been practicing on every morning for weeks. It was like greeting an old friend. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them again, the nervousness was gone. He wasn't Tommy the foster kid anymore. He wasn't Tommy the scholarship student who didn't belong. He was just Tommy the musician, ready to share his story with the world. He began to play, and the first notes of Chopin filled the concert hall like a prayer. The opening notes of Chopin's ballad flowed from Tommy's fingers like water from a spring. Every person in the concert hall seemed to hold their breath as the gentle melody filled the space. This wasn't the mechanical playing they had heard from other contestants. This was something different. This was music that came from the heart. Tommy's eyes were closed as he played, lost in the story he was telling. The soft beginning represented hope. The hope of a young boy who dreamed of something better than the life he had been given. His touch was so delicate that some notes barely whispered, while others sang with a sweetness that made people lean forward in their seats. As the piece developed, the music grew more complex. Tommy's left hand played a steady rhythm while his right hand danced across the higher keys, weaving melodies that seemed to float above the bass line. This section represented struggle, the daily battles of growing up without a real family, of never knowing where home would be next week. In the audience, Mrs. Rodriguez wiped tears from her eyes. She had heard Tommy play before, but never like this. This wasn't just a performance. It was the story of every foster child who had ever felt alone in the world. The music continued to build, and Tommy's playing became more passionate. His whole body swayed with the rhythm as his fingers flew across the keys. The Steinway responded to his every touch, producing sounds that seemed impossible from wood and metal and wire. This section represented anger, the fury of being judged by circumstances beyond his control, of being told he didn't belong in places he had every right to be. Victoria sat in the front row with her parents, her mouth slightly open in shock. She had expected Tommy to embarrass himself, to prove that scholarship students didn't deserve to compete with their social superiors. Instead, she was watching someone transform a concert hall full of skeptics into believers. The piece reached its climactic section, and Tommy's playing became thunderous. His hands moved so fast they were almost a blur, yet every note was crystal clear. The piano seemed to shake under the power of his performance, but somehow the music never lost its beauty. This section represented determination, the refusal to give up even when everyone expected failure. People in the audience were no longer sitting politely in their seats. Some were leaning forward with their mouths open. Others had tears streaming down their faces. A few were gripping the armrests of their chairs so tightly their knuckles had turned white. Bradley, who had mocked Tommy on his first day, sat frozen in his seat. He had grown up around classical music and had attended hundreds of concerts, but he had never heard anything like this. This wasn't just technical skill. This was raw emotion transformed into sound. As the piece neared its end, Tommy's playing became softer again, but somehow more powerful than before. The final section represented acceptance, not giving up, but finding peace with the journey and strength for whatever came next. His fingers caressed the keys like he was saying goodbye to an old friend. The last note hung in the air for what seemed like forever. Tommy kept his hands on the keys and his eyes closed, as if he was afraid to break the spell. The concert hall was completely silent. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Nobody wanted the moment to end. Then someone in the back started clapping. Slowly, others joined in, until the entire hall erupted in applause, unlike anything Westfield Academy had ever heard. People weren't just clapping politely anymore. They were standing, shouting, wiping tears from their eyes. Some were applauding so hard their hands hurt. Tommy opened his eyes and looked out at the audience in amazement. He had expected polite applause at best, maybe some scattered clapping from people who felt sorry for him. Instead, he saw hundreds of people on their feet, giving him the kind of ovation usually reserved for professional concerts. Mrs. Rodriguez was sobbing openly, not caring who saw her. Robert stood near the back of the hall with a huge grin on his face, clapping so hard his cleaning cart was shaking. Even some of the wealthiest parents, who had come expecting to see their own children win, were applauding with genuine enthusiasm. But Tommy wasn't finished yet. He still had his second piece to play, the Rachmaninoff that had challenged him every morning during those secret practice sessions. He waited for the applause to die down, then placed his hands on the keys once again. If the Chopin had been about his journey, the Rachmaninoff was about his destination. It started with a bang, powerful chords that announced his arrival on the classical music scene. This piece was technically more difficult than anything else performed that evening, with passages that would challenge even professional pianists. Tommy attacked the keys with controlled fury, his fingers flying through runs and arpeggios that seemed impossible. But this wasn't just showing off. Every difficult passage served the musical story he was telling. This piece was about triumph, not just winning a competition, but proving that talent and determination could overcome any obstacle. The audience was transfixed. Some people were recording on their phones knowing they were witnessing something special. Others just watched in amazement as this young man, who many of them had dismissed as a charity case, played music that was both technically brilliant and emotionally devastating. Victoria's father leaned over to whisper something to his wife, but she shushed him without taking her eyes off the stage. The man who had donated the piano Tommy was playing on was watching in fascination as someone finally brought out its full potential. As Tommy reached the final section of the Rachmaninoff, his playing became almost superhuman. His hands moved independently across the keyboard, creating layers of sound that seemed to come from multiple instruments. The piano sang and thundered and whispered all at the same time. When the last note rang out, the silence lasted even longer than before. Then the applause began again, even more enthusiastic than the first time. People were shouting, "Bravo" and "Incredible." Some were crying openly. Others just stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Tommy stood up from the piano bench and bowed, still not quite believing what had just happened. As he walked off the stage, he passed the remaining contestants who were supposed to perform after him. Their faces showed a mixture of admiration and defeat. They knew there was no point in continuing. The competition was over. The judges didn't even need to deliberate. When all the performances were finished, they announced that Tommy had won by unanimous decision. The head judge, a famous pianist from the City Symphony, stood up to address the audience. "In 30 years of judging competitions," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "I have never heard a performance that combined such technical brilliance with such emotional depth. This young man doesn't just play music, he lives it." As Tommy walked back on stage to accept his trophy, Victoria approached him in the wings. Her face was red with a mixture of shame and anger. For weeks, she had been so confident that her cruel plan would work. "You knew," she said quietly so others couldn't hear. "You knew about the fake piano all along." Tommy looked at her with more sadness than anger. "I figured it out," he admitted, "but it doesn't matter what kind of piano you give someone who has music in their soul." Victoria stared at him for a moment, then walked away without another word. She couldn't understand how someone with so little could create something so beautiful. Later, that evening as the crowd began to leave, Tommy found Robert near the stage. The janitor was putting away folding chairs, but he stopped when he saw Tommy approaching with his trophy. "I couldn't have done this without you," Tommy said, his voice thick with emotion. Robert smiled and put his arm around Tommy's shoulder. "Son, I didn't teach you how to play. I just gave you a place to practice. That music came from inside you." Mrs. Rodriguez appeared beside them, still wiping tears from her eyes. "I'm so proud of you," she said, pulling Tommy into a hug. "But I always knew you had this in you." As Tommy stood there surrounded by the people who had believed in him, he realized something important. The competition had never really been about beating Victoria or the other wealthy students. It had been about proving to himself that he was worthy of his dreams. The scholarship money would help him attend music school, and the recording session would give him professional exposure. But the real prize was something no one could take away from him. He had discovered that talent, hard work, and determination were more powerful than money or privilege. Years later, when Tommy became a famous concert pianist, he would always remember the night at Westfield Academy when he learned that the biggest barriers in life aren't the ones other people put in front of you. They're the ones you put in front of yourself. And once you tear those down, nothing can stop you from achieving your dreams.